Welcome to Make It Clear show. Can President Putin be trusted not to invade Poland or Latvia? What role did the intelligence services play in the Russian-American stakes? Were the Russians naive about NATO expansion? And how will the conflict in Ukraine play out, given that Vladimir Putin says Russia cannot be defeated militarily? This will also be discussed. Today, the security analyst, columnist, and charter signatory 77 has accepted the invitation. Former director of the Czech Government Intelligence Council Office, BIS administrator, and also a recipient of the State Medal of Merit, Mr. Jan Schneider. Good afternoon. Hello. Mr. Schneider, a number of commentators and political analysts are now commenting on Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin, while at the same time saying that they have not actually seen the whole interview and do not want to see it. They are satisfied with the excerpts published by whichever news agency. What do you think of this approach?
Well, that is a very typical approach. It reminds me of a joke from the brutal totalitarianism when it was so anti-Narusians, when the KGB arrests a man handing out papers in the square, and when they drag him to the office, they find out that he was handing out blank papers, and so they say, "What the hell?" And he says, "Well, why bother? It's all clear." So these people are also clear before, and they don't really need that reality. They live in their ideologically totally hardened, hermetically sealed bubble, and they are very resistant to the penetration of any oxygen molecule that would simply oxygenate their flabby mosques. I can't put it any other way.
We know that you have studied the interview, and we in the editorial office have also watched it in its entirety, just to be clear. So let's analyze it now from the perspective of your profession, that is, from the perspective of a security analyst. President Putin said that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans deceived Russia. He said that the United States had promised that NATO would not expand eastwards, and then there were 5 expansions. At the same time, however, Putin bitterly stated that this was a verbal promise. And when Russia objected to NATO expansion, the Americans should have told him, quote, "It's not on paper, so we're going to expand it." Let's break down that message. Was the United States really that gulibli and Russia that naive on NATO?
I don't know if you can call it naive. I think it was complete fairness. There was a very interesting moment there when this Reagan and Gorbachev were talking like grown men. And Reagan actually probably already suspected how he had been hideously cheated with the Star Wars that the United States had spent an insane amount of money on, and it hadn't really worked at all. It was just a fling. By the way, Mr. Bittman, in his book International Information, which is in English but almost unavailable, writes about the fact that in the test of those Star Wars, the rocket that was shot down attracted the rocket that shot it down. So it was just a whole big hoax, and they found out that actually grown men were taking care of the real problems, and that weaponization, that it was actually an anti-civilization phenomenon. So it was such a big, very dignified, so to speak, in that history of the 20th century and in that moment and among civilized nations, that an oral promise, and it's in our criminal code as well, that an oral promise is as valid as a written promise. So if somebody doesn't keep their word, it's hard to assume that they would keep anything in writing. For the United States, international commitments are just a piece of paper. And if you look at the basic NATO document, which is the Treaty of Washington, as taught by Miroslav Poloreich, the intelligence and diplomatic expert, there is only one commitment, and that is in Article 1, that NATO is committed to resolving all disputes peacefully. The NATO signatories and such more aggressive ones say, well, yeah, so it's just paper, times are different now, and so on. So To argue that the pledge wasn't made on paper is completely believable, disingenuous, and generally just shows the crooked nature of the people who are just using this. That's where I think it's good to change the context that the expansion of NATO was seen as a mistake by, for example, George Kennan, the author of that theory of containment of communism, Merzheimer, Jeffrey Sachs, Kissinger, Brzezinski, just the whole George Friedman, the whole plethora of geopoliticians, geoanalysts said that it was just, Kennan even said that it was the biggest mistake, like in the history of the second half of the 20th century, in the history of the United States. So the NATO expansion, the non-expansion of NATO was very logical. And when it was promised, I think there was very good reason to believe it. But then there was just a different set of people who threw in the pitchfork.
I would like to ask you, looking back on your years in the security service and your role as a security analyst, what were you saying to yourself at a time when, contrary to that promise, NATO was actually beginning to expand, including, therefore, our country?
It was a kind of, I would say, adolescent wish of many politicians who had not seen the consequences, had not studied actually the trajectories, the latest trajectories of NATO development, and fulfilled a bit of a childhood dream. It was something similar to the European Union, which we entered into, and we imagined a little bit differently, and we just didn't see the horrible development similarly with NATO. So it was a mistake. It was a mistake, let's say, understandable. As far as the Czech Republic joining NATO, I think it was even tolerable from the Russian side. But the one when NATO actually started contacting the Russian borders, that was long over the line. And what a lot of people are parroting, that every state has the right to do what it likes, doesn't apply here, because they're only saying half of the geopolitical principle, that every state has the right to do what it likes, taking into account that a neighboring state should not feel threatened in its security. That's the whole sentence. And NATO was just doing everything it could to provoke the Russians. If you take that, it was a pretty inconsistent action. And then when the biolabs were discovered in Ukraine, when the president of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Gross, then said that there were 30 tons of plutonium in the Zaporozhye plant, which is absolutely absurd. Ukraine gave up its neutrality, which it had in its constitution, so there was a whole series of leaving aside the provocation by the Russians, by the suppression of the Russian language, the suppression of the rights of the Russian-speaking population, the banning of competing political parties, the restriction of the media, not to mention the huge decline in neo-Nazism, which was noted by prestigious magazines in the United States. This is simply not Russian propaganda, it is objective fact, or Russia was indeed being deliberately provoked.
Neonacismu, které konstatovali prostě prestižní časopisy Spojených států, to není prostě žádná ruská propaganda, to je objektivní fakt, čili Rusko skutečně bylo cíleně provokováno.
If you allow me, I will take the conversation further in line with what President Putin said, so that we can analyze what was said there. So, in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Vladimir Putin identified the year to 2008 as an important year when NATO declared that the door was open to Ukraine and Georgia. Vladimir Putin said that Germany, France, and other European countries seemed to be against it at the time. But he also pointed out that later it turned out that the Americans had put pressure on them, and those countries agreed. Was that the case, or was it not?
I think it was absolutely outrageous on the part of the Ukrainian representation, because in the year 2008, Ukraine was a neutral state with a constitution, or any negotiations to join NATO were unconstitutional. That is hardly ever emphasized. Ukraine received its guarantees of territorial inviolability as a neutral state. When Ukraine's rebellious Duma then gave up neutrality with a triumphant roar in the autumn of that year, that is proof that the neutrality was in that constitution. So you have to take all the data, all the events around Ukraine, with the fact that by the year 2014, Ukraine had simply declared its neutrality.
Vladimir Putin said several times in the interview that Russia wanted to talk to the Americans, that they wanted to talk, but basically they had no one to talk to. If we look at the long-term relations between the two superpowers, they talk to each other formally or constructively and frankly.
I think the only partner, admittedly, it's a bit of a cop-out, given his slightly eccentric character, was Donald Trump, who was just very pragmatic as a businessman. So even though he's eccentric as a personality, as a thank you, but that doesn't play a role in this case. I think that was the only partner. Otherwise, those Democrats were sort of driving a very offensive, aggressive policy towards Russia, or I guess there really wasn't anybody to talk to.
Vladimir Putin also recalled in the interview a conversation with President Clinton in which he was asked whether Russia would be admitted to the sea if asked. According to Putin at the time, Clinton said yes. But a few hours later he told him, quote, he had spoken to his team and now it's not possible. So it could have been, it couldn't have been. Your opinion?
It certainly could have been, and it's probably indicative of the new professionalism and firmness of opinion and orientation in general. The Russians, or it was still the Soviet Union, were caught off guard several times by this very request. A long time ago, this was repeated again. As you say, the first time, a repeated joke is a joke, so they were stopped because basically nothing prevented it at all. And if other countries were taken into NATO, why wouldn't Russia be taken in? Incidentally, I suspect Henry Kissinger was in favor of that rather than the Central European states joining NATO. That was about us. Kissinger at the time preferred to deal with Russia and not simply with us. So he knew the game that was being played here, that somebody wanted to make a deal with Russia because he understood that geopolitics had been reformatted a little bit, I would say fundamentally, just by the rise of China. And mind you, he is terribly oblivious to India now, which is rocketing. And Kissinger understood that and took Russia as a potential ally, which is, I think, geopolitically, history will show that that view was correct. And, but there was also somewhere in that interview, I guess those Americans didn't speak Arabic, they didn't speak Farsi, they didn't speak Chinese, and there were a lot of veterans who could speak Russian. And after the Cold War was over, they said, well, what are we going to do now? We're going to learn Chinese, we're not going to learn Chinese. Well, it's best to make Russia the enemy again because we know Russian. So there was this really ridiculous inertia which led to the US intelligence services deciding to target the former Soviet Union, Russia, and completely ignore the whole geopolitical development, which I think is a fatal mistake for years to come.
Což je, myslím, pro budoucí roky naprosto fatální chyba, se ukáže, jo.
It was also mentioned several times in Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin that the intelligence services play a strong role in US politics, perhaps even more so than politicians themselves. Vladimir Putin claimed in the interview that the CIA admitted to him that it was cooperating with Russia, but that it had written to the director of Russian intelligence saying that it was cooperating with the opposition in Russia, that it believed it was the right thing to do and that it would continue to do so. How would you characterize the relationship between superpowers when the intelligence service of one superpower cooperates with the opposition of the other superpower?
Well, to me, as Woody Allen says in his famous movie Bananas, the CIA doesn't risk the CIA working with both sides. So the CIA does support opposition in many countries, and very unpleasant opposition. It's like, from a human rights point of view, better not even talk about who all they support. On the other hand, you know it, even the intelligence environment is not uniform, and there are unquestionably very worthy spirits who say what Miroslav Polreich just mentioned, that intelligence services should work in the outpost of diplomacy, that is, where even diplomatic contacts, if they became known, would not be very good. So that's where intelligence officers work. And I think this is a very, to me, almost key issue in that conversation, when the old administration, the old intelligence veteran Putin just admits that those intelligence services are in touch. To me, that's a great hope.
Starý zpravodajský veterán Putin prostě přizná, že ty zpravodajské služby jsou v kontaktu. Pro mě to je veliká naděje.
Because here it's not CIA and Russian opposition contact, it's CIA and Russian intelligence contact. And these people suspect very well this melting escalation, where it would lead and how terribly dangerous it is. So at this point, I think it's an awfully interesting signal where reason could regain sort of its lost role in international relations. And I think it's probably an afterthought for certain circles in the United States to confirm that the Russian openness is there, but that the negotiations are just going to be difficult, but that they're actually open to that negotiation, that there's just something going on. To me, that's kind of a hint of something that's probably not good to presume too much, because we're not sort of at home in this, but I don't want to use the word signal, but it's a very good hint that there was still that hope left.
Nechci použít to slovo signál, ale je to velmi dobrý náznak, že ještě ta naděje zbývá.
Let us now turn to Ukraine itself. Vladimir Putin claims that it all started about 11 years ago, when Ukraine started to deal with the question of association with the European Union. At that time, Ukraine had a free trade area with Russia, and if it had concluded an association agreement with the European Union, Russia would have been flooded with EU goods through that very agreement. At that time, Russia should have said that in the event of an association agreement, it would effectively cancel the free trade agreement with Ukraine. According to Putin, then Ukrainian President Yanukovych started calculating how much Ukraine would gain and told European partners that he needed more time. Vladimir Putin went on to say that the moment Yanukovych said this, the Ukrainian opposition began to take destructive steps backed by the West, all leading to the Maidan and the coup in Ukraine. Was that true, or was it not?
I think that the skeleton is absolutely correct, because Yanukovych's calculation was very much on the mark. He calculated it very well. The Russians knew that they would end up, as we are basically ending up, awash in very poor quality but massively underpriced and very dumped Western production. We're liquidating our food, manufacturing industries, it's hitting agriculture, and it's basically a kind of conquest of countries by peaceful means. The Russians probably knew very well what would happen, or what the stop sign was for Ukraine to think about what they actually wanted. It must be said that Ukraine at that time benefited enormously from very cheap Russian gas, energy in general, plus the transit, or they really had nothing to complain about economically. The interconnectedness of Ukrainian and Russian industry was great, so it ensured economic stability there in the long term. So the tempting offer from the West was basically destructive, and it was only right that Yanukovych refused it. Incidentally, this aggressiveness was evident from what happened on the Maidan, and it is extremely interesting, by the way, that to this day, Ukraine, despite the fact that nothing has prevented it from doing so, has not investigated what actually happened on the Maidan, because that would be a very unpleasant discovery. Similarly, they have not investigated the massacre in Odessa, where almost 50 people were burnt to death, which was one of the most heinous crimes ever committed in the 21st century, and they have not investigated it either, because it would actually be directed at their own ranks. So there you can see that the aggression from the West was first anointed with honey, that there were honeyed words about how Ukraine is going to do well, but it was really aimed at sort of the economic conquest of Ukraine, which is conquest in hard and fast terms, or they want to own it. And about a third of the Ukrainian black land no longer belongs to the Ukrainians. And of course, all those debts for arms supplies are written on their futures as a debt, and then they're going to count it, or when there's some kind of peaceful solution, the Ukrainians with will be horrified to find out that they don't even own a chair. They're sitting under.
I would still stay in the Maidan period, because Vladimir Putin said in that context, and I quote, "The United States told us, calm down Yanukovych, and we will calm down the opposition. Let the situation develop. We said, okay, we agreed, we'll do it this way." As the Americans demanded, Yanukovych did not use either the armed forces or the police. Yet the armed opposition committed a coup in Kiev. End quote. According to Vladimir Putin, this coup was engineered with the support of the CIA. Again, your worthy explanation, was it not?
Well, no doubt, Victoria Nuland, in her plain-spokenness, burned some very important data several times. There was the billions of dollars that went into the so-called democratization of a foreign country. Just imagine if the Russians had paid for the democratization of Mexico, for example, what would the Americans' reaction to that be? So there, the pull on that gate was huge. Basically, I can't say anything other than I agree with that, because obviously that's kind of how it played out. An illustration of that is the alleged guarantee by the German, French, and Polish officials the day before the main attack on Maidan actually occurred. Another illustration is actually Merkel's ex-post statement on Minsk, that they also signed something. They also didn't bother to follow through on anything like that. We can retrospectively project that to, if they had signed the non-proliferation on that, it would have been worth about the same, just like their guarantees before Maidan and after those Minsk agreements. It's been one deception after another, and basically any of their written statements cannot be trusted at all.
Vladimir Putin also said in that interview, just in the context of the Maidan, and as he says, the coup in Ukraine, quote, "It was culpable negligence on our part. That would be it. We were just pushed by the US political leadership to a line that we couldn't cross because it would destroy Russia itself." Say, wasn't it somewhat, I don't want to say naive at the time on Russia's part, but maybe that's why you'll have a different word. But wasn't it somewhat imprudent of Russia to think that they and the Americans could somehow share influence in Ukraine?
It was probably pragmatic. It was probably an attempt to make some very sort of ideological solution. Just the cards are dealt, the troops are standing where they are, so let's try to calm things down and not piss each other off further, but they're actually naive there, I don't know. It was just like in hockey, one hockey player just pokes you with the other guy's stick. and then the one in question, the fouled guy, gets mad and punches the other guy and he's out. So that's the way I take it. It's just that the United States has been constantly putting pressure on that Russian for 30 years. Until the Russians said there's a red line, and they kept acting like there wasn't, and then they were surprised that the Russians just intervened. There's a question there too, the historical fluency. I was kind of amused by that parallel. Putin is giving some historical excursus. We may agree with him, we may not. I was wondering if an American president would be able to give a similar excursus about the history of the United States. The apartment is 1,000 years shorter. About our president, well, we'd rather not elaborate on that. So that history plays a role there, and the Russians still have that 31st year in their minds, because there's basically no family there that didn't suffer some losses in that great patriotic war. And Putin just didn't want to come to that. They hadn't defended themselves once before in a similar situation. It's just that Stalin was still doing everything he could not to provoke that Hitler, and it didn't turn out well. So Putin tried. They had two options, and they were both bad. Putin tried the second one because objectively, when you take it, all the signals, when you line them up chronologically, really 30 years of systematic pressure on Russia has produced this result, and Kissinger knew it. He predicted it simply. Nobody can say that this is only Putin's opinion. It's simply, I would say, it's very close to an objective assessment.
You mentioned the Minsk agreements a moment ago. Vladimir Putin also touched on them and said in the interview that the former leaders of Germany and France basically never wanted to abide by them, and that they all wanted to solve the problem only by military force. Vladimir Putin says that he believes that the war was started in 2014, and Russia's goal in 2022 of that special operation, as he puts it, was to stop the war in the Donbass. What do you make of that interpretation of the situation?
I totally agree with it, because any first-year military school student knows that to derive the objectives of any military campaign from the forces and means used, and what Russia used in Ukraine was really not sufficient to occupy the whole of Ukraine, as many of our so-called experts simply suggest to Putin. They say, and it didn't work. No, he really didn't have it in the balance, because the targets and the means deployed simply matched the actual, as you say, the Donbass. The attack on Kiev, of course, was from a drawdown or to develop a front. And as Putin has repeatedly been very emphatic about, they pulled back from Kiev after the signing or after the Istanbul Agreement, where actually the Ukrainian leader tentatively agreed to a peace settlement. And then this crazy Boris Johnson just poured in and just unleashed all of this. Boris Johnson is probably one of the biggest criminals just running around the globe at the moment.
Boris Johnson je asi jeden z největších zločinců, který v současné době prostě běhají po země kouli.
The Russian president has said that the special operation is aimed at denazification. He emphasized that several times in that interview and also explained why. After independence, he said, Ukraine began to search, as some Western analysts say, for its identity, and Vladimir Putin said they could think of nothing better than to build that identity on false heroes who collaborated with Hitler. The Russian president went on to say, quote, "These people have become national heroes in Ukraine. Memorials have been built to these people. They are depicted on flags. Their names are shouted by crowds that walk with torches, as they did in Nazi Germany. They were the people who exterminated the Poles, the Jews, and the Russians." Do you also see the situation in Ukraine through that lens?
Absolutely, exactly. I'm terribly sorry about the hypocrisy of Europe, which is nowadays talking about the Holocaust again and just bringing up some memories. and putting up how much it cares about this memory so that it doesn't fit. And on the other hand, he suffers perfectly calmly from the marches of former SS men in Riga. Minister Lipavsky replied that this was an internal Latvian matter and that we had nothing to interfere in it. If they want to know about Bandera, they should ask the Poles. I think that the Poles there in the west of Ukraine will, when the time comes, show them such a debanderization that the Ukrainians will be terribly surprised because the Poles have it. They have these memorials. They have simply forgotten, let me die simply, erased the memory of those victims of Bandera. So this is really like a barrel of dynamite that they are just very careless with it. The whole history of the Baltics and Hitler, yes, the Baltics were making treaties long before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty. After all, the very first state to make a treaty with Nazi Germany was Poland.
Smlouvou Molotov-Ribbentrop dělali smlouvy. Ostatně vůbec první stát, který udělal smlouvu s nacistickým Německem, bylo Polsko.
In the year 34, and in 35 Hitler was at Pilsudski's funeral. This just tends to be forgotten, or Putin has a lot of bullets still in the bag that he can use. Simply, they're very selective when they want to talk about that history. So this Browning of Europe Forward magazine, the American magazine Forward magazine, has put out a dossier on how many memorials in Ukraine have been named simply after actual war criminals. So this is just, unfortunately, this is not a fabrication of Putin. Unfortunately, it's true. It's just that Ukraine is Browning in an incredible way, and Europe is helping it to do so, even though it has a mouthful of respect for the victims of the Holocaust. Just the hypocrisy is absolutely appalling.
I apologize for digressing for a moment, but I must confess that I was disturbed by recent information in our press that the Terezin Memorial and the Lidisi Memorial will be holding far fewer 5 events or events associated with the 5 this year, precisely because there is no money for them. How do you see this in the context of what we are discussing right now, Mr. Schneider?
Maybe there is no money because the Bandera people are being supported.
Yes, but it also does not contribute to the fact that it can then happen that such countries where this is not mentioned can more easily turn brown.
Certainly, and I fear that this is even the intention of some, because my friend Standa Motel, when I expressed my concern about the browning of Europe and how this Hitler is evolving, and that in fact this Hitler is already echoing here, that Hitler was actually defending that Europe from that communism, and the money that was deposited there in the spring of 45, that was the Nazi and Ustasha loot, is going to be lost from Latin America. So when I told him that, Standa shuddered at the time and said, but Simon Wiesenthal expressed similar concerns in an interview with me, and I certainly don't think we're going to question Simon Wiesenthal's erudition and life experience. It's just that the tendency to brown Europe is here, unfortunately, and I see this as sort of these little manifestations where they are pushing those boundaries, and yet they are really full of respect for just the Holocaust, and for those memories, they are actually doing something completely different, completely the opposite.
Let's go back to the interview with Vladimir Putin. In the interview, he denied that Russia wanted to attack Poland, Latvia, or other countries, while saying that the country's politicians are scaring their own populations with an imaginary Russian threat. Do you believe him?
Well, that's exactly what it looks like from an outsider's point of view, because As I say, the forces and the means used really correspond to what he declared, which is to protect the Russian-speaking population in the Donbass, who were simply being denied the use of their mother tongue. The language law was a very clear provocation to create that conflict there, which could be used as a pretext to bring more armed forces to Russia's borders. When Russia brought its own armed forces to its own borders, it was interpreted as an aggressive move. So it's really like locking your door at home. A burglar would interpret that as aggression against his peace-loving efforts.
Takže to je skutečně, jako když si zamknete doma dveře, tak jako by to zloděj vykládal jako agresi proti jeho míru milovným snahám. Jo.
At the same time, Vladimir Putin has said that Russia cannot be defeated on the battlefield. He is right.
Well, if you look at Afghanistan, at Iraq, where psycho-Western technology failed, now look at what actually happened in Gaza, where they used absolutely primitive means against sophisticated F-30s, beloved of Mrs. Chernakov, which were flying around the cloud absolutely helplessly, and those drones overtook the fence there and wreaked havoc. So you see that Western sophisticated military technology is absolutely useless. I saw a wonderful shot recently of some Arab in the desert being alerted to a drone flying over him, and he bends down in the mosque and with a beautiful shot accurately hits the drone's camera. So it's like that childhood game of rock, paper, scissors, that for every weapon there is a countermeasure, and for these very sophisticated weapon systems there are just even very primitive means. And when you take the size of Russia, the resources, when you think about who all has failed militarily there, I think that overall it's kind of like a very easy answer to whether Russia can be conquered but not conquered.
You mentioned during the interview that Vladimir Putin talked about history. I will add to that Vladimir Putin also talked about faith. It is not very common for presidents of great powers to make historical excursions in interviews and talk about faith. To what extent do you think this distinguishes Russia from other great powers?
Well, I guess in China the question of religion is not a frequent policy issue. I'm not that knowledgeable. In Israel, again, it's like one of the fundamental issues to the detriment of the cause, of course. Well, the United States, if you take it, they have it on the banknotes. And young Bush, when he wasn't drinking, he was talking to the Lord God, who was giving him instructions on what to do. So I think this Putin was talking about religion in more of a cultural, historical sense. That's the background. I thought his reference to religion was quite fitting, and religion is part of the life of our civilization, and it just has to have its sort of appropriate role. It's a mistake not to mention it because it exists. It's a mistake to overestimate it and make it some kind of foundation for other decisions. However, religion does play a real role in Russia. In the end, when you listen to Rachmaninoff and these spiritual chants, you end up feeling a certain vibration that is not rationally explained, but you know that it just has a tremendous effect on people. So I feel like he was talking about it in a sort of modest, discreet way, but that the power of that religion in Russia is probably greater than it seems.
Last question. To what extent do you think the conversation between Czech Council and Vladimir Putin about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the security situation in general was groundbreaking, and will it affect the conflict between Russia and Ukraine in any way?
The conflict will probably affect maybe the context, as you say. That's the right last question, because that's maybe the most important thing, the context in which the whole conversation took place, because Putin has made it clear that he is willing to talk. He's willing to talk to someone who has his respect, which is not everyone. So he's certainly not going to lose out on that, like a lot of hateful comments. And it certainly doesn't end with Mrs. Nemkova, because her statement today is really comical and speaks more about her. The point here really is that the Washington Treaty was created in that year of '94 as the basis of NATO, and it has in the first article simply that one commitment to negotiate, or he's actually complying with that basic NATO mission of wanting to resolve conflicts by negotiation, Putin, even though those conflicts have already occurred, but it's just never too late to negotiate.
Konflikty jednáním. Byť už ty konflikty nastaly, ale prostě na to jednání nikdy není pozdě.
And it's also, of course, some influence, indirect influence on this US election, because everybody who doesn't want to see further escalation of that conflict in Ukraine knows that that path is through Trump rather than through Biden. In the Russian election, of course, it will probably have some influence too. And the question now, and I'll come back to the Bandera thing because it's terribly interesting, if by any chance the removal of Zaluzhny is a condition for some peace negotiations, because Zaluzhny was photographed from the background. There was a photo of Bandera, and the comment was that Zaluzhny was always close to these right-wing sectors and these extreme circles. And if maybe the removal of this Zaluzhny opens the way for peace negotiations, because I can imagine certain circles would be bothered by simply this Zaluzhny's inclination to just these extremist Bandera, and that there's a bit of a purging of that spectrum of people that the West and the East would be willing to deal with. So this just struck me because I was very surprised by the photo where he declared just this affection for Bandera. So maybe these are the kind of baby steps that are contributing to
Takže možná to jsou takový drobní krůčky, které přispívají k tomu, že
sense that these negotiations to end the conflict could really be a matter of perhaps weeks, but months, certainly this year.
Nejbližších, ne snad týdnů, ale měsíců, rozhodně tohoto roku.
I thank you for the interview.
I thank you for the invitation.